Howdy Planeswalkers, I'm Amy the Amazonian, and in this video I'll be showing off the new cards coming to Magic the Gathering Arena as part of Alchemy, Junction. These cards release on May 7th, and they'll be playable in Timeless, Historic, Brawl, and Alchemy. And some of these cards have a brand new ability, Heist. Heist is a new keyword ability that lets you target an opponent, which is a crime, and look at 3 random non-land cards from their library. You choose one of the 3, and it gets exiled face down. So long as it remains exiled, you can cast it, and you can use mana of any color to cast it. This means that you don't just get to take cards from your opponent, but you get to select from a variety of them so you can pick the best one for any circumstance. And who better to do crime than Grenzo, Crooked Jailer? Grenzo is a 6-mana, 6/4 Goblin Rogue, and when he enters the battlefield and at the start of your upkeep, you heist from target opponent's library. And once each turn, you may pay 0 rather than the mana cost of a spell that you do not own to cast it. This means that you get to take from your opponent's deck and then cast those spells for free. This ability also works with other cards like Robber of the Rich, Rahilda, Ragavan, Gonti, the other Gonti, and Laughing Jasper Flint. There are so many great ways to exile from your opponent's deck and cast those spells now for free on both yours and your opponent's turns. This Grenzo also works well with all of the other heist cards that are coming out in Alchemy Junction, like Weave the Nightmare. Weave the Nightmare is an exceptionally versatile card. This is a 3-mana instant that is a counter spell, a kill spell, and card advantage. You get to choose one of these modes, or 2 if you control a non-land permanent that you do not own. The 3 modes are heisting from your target opponent's library, giving a creature -5/-5 until end of turn, or countering target non-creature spell. At only 3 mana, the versatility and the value stapled into this card make it a really strong uncommon. Thieving Aven also benefits from these crimes that we're committing. Speaking of which, because Heist is a crime, it's also very good for cards like Jisa and Carefak. Thieving Aven is a 1/4 bird rogue. It's got flying, and this evasion enables its abilities. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you heist target opponent's library. And whenever you cast a spell you do not own, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Thieving Aven, letting your bird rogue get bigger and bigger as you take more and more cards from your opponent's library. Something notable about this heist mechanic, by the way, is that you do not need to cast these spells that you're taking. I've had opportunities to take a spell from my opponent where you just want to deny your opponent that card. Maybe it's part of a combo. Maybe it's the big card that would stop your deck. Maybe it's just a win con that you're not ready to deal with. You let it stay in exile, and your opponent doesn't know that it's in exile because Heist is face down, while you sit there waiting until maybe you have a good chance to cast it later. This Thieving Aven seems like it would be a fun card to pair with Weave the Nightmare and many of the other crime-related cards that happen to be in this set. Speaking of which, the Impetuous Lootmonger is a 2-mana 2/2 with first strike that also heists. When it enters the battlefield, you discard a card, and then you heist target opponent's library. And whenever you cast a spell that you do not own, you get a treasure token, meaning that if you have something like Grenzo out, you're actually getting mana for nothing when you cast those spells for free. Impetuous Lootmonger is phrased in such a way that if your hand is empty when you cast him, you actually discard nothing and still get to heist from your opponent's library. Otherwise, this is a way of taking a card you don't really need from your hand and trying to get better selection from your opponent's deck. This also works really well with anything that's casting from your opponents, like Xanathar, because the more that you can cast, the more treasure you're going to get to keep on casting those stolen spells. And of course, we have to have the big Grixis card that pulls it all together, Triumphant Getaway. This is a 4-mana enchantment with flash. When it enters, you heist from target opponent's library twice, and whenever you cast a spell you don't own, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life, keeping you alive, taking out your opponents, all by generating value. It's rewarding you for doing something that you'd want to do anyway. Not every card in Alchemy Junction is about playing from your opponent's deck. Jessie Zane Fangbringer is a card about snakes. Jessie Zane is a 3-mana 3/4 with Death Touch. When she enters the battlefield, and whenever you cast a snake spell, you conjure an Ambush Viper into the top 6 cards of your library at random. That Ambush Viper also gets the text, Whenever this creature enters the battlefield, you draw a card. This card is incredible in the Fangbringer Brawl deck. If you've never played one of these, it's all about playing lots and lots of death-touching creatures to take out your opponent with poison counters. And Jesse Zane Fangbringer gives you an endless supply of flash death-touching snakes. Those ambush vipers are sure to surprise your opponents when they start showing up, and keep showing up as you keep drawing more cards and making more ambush vipers. Wagon Wrecker is a 2-mana 2/1 ogre mercenary with menace, and it doesn't just attack your opponent's life total, it also attacks their hand. Whenever Wagon Wrecker deals combat damage to a player, a random non-land card in their hand perpetually gains the text, "When you cast this spell, you lose 2 life," forcing your opponent to choose between casting their spells and taking a lot of damage. Wagon Wrecker is also a mercenary, which does mean that it counts towards your outlaws for cards like Laughing Jasper Flint. This feels like a great aggressive red card to me that I hope sees play in Alchemy. Prairie Survivalist is another fairly aggressive card, a 2-mana 0/1 with flying that grows during each of your combats. At the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control perpetually gets +1/+0. Then you choose a creature card in your hand to also get +1/+0. This reminds me a bit of Luminarch Aspirant, but it's not just growing itself or another card on your board, it's also giving you some future value by growing a card that's in your hand. Because the Prairie Survivalist also has evasion, it gives you a great way to build up this big flyer and swing in at your opponent's life total. Prairie Survivalist is also a human, which might be relevant if you happen to be building a human deck. If you're looking to ramp, Rune-Carved Obelisk is a great resource. This is a 4-mana artifact that taps for 2 colorless mana, similar to cards like Hedron Archive. Each time you tap it for mana, you add 2 charge counters for it. When you're ready, you can also tap it, sacrifice it, and seek a card with the highest mana value among cards in your library with mana value X or less, where X is the number of charge counters on it, meaning that the longer this is in the game and the more charge counters you put on it, the higher cost spell you're guaranteed to get from your deck. I could see this going into any colorless ramp deck, or just a deck that's looking to use artifact-based ramp. It also is very nice if you're trying to get a specific card out of your library with a very high mana cost. I'm thinking like maybe Ulamog in Historic Brawl, one of the big Eldrazi, could be a great target for that Seek ability. Resolute Rejection is a removal spell in white. This is a 2-mana instant that targets a tapped creature, removes that creature's abilities, and then deals 4 damage to it. This isn't going to be enough to take out all creatures, but oftentimes removing the ability of a creature is enough to make it killable with everything else on the board. This also gets around things like Indestructible, removing that ability so the 4 damage can kill it. If 4 damage and removing abilities isn't what you need, or if your opponent just doesn't have any tapped creatures, you can also choose to cycle this for 2 mana, discarding it and drawing another card. That's a great bit of versatility on a white removal spell. Intruder's Inquisition is another alliterative removal spell, but this time in black and red. This 2-mana sorcery has target creature you control deal damage equal to its power to a creature your opponent controls, and if it deals excess damage this way, then your opponent is forced to discard the highest cost card from their hand. This is a great way of guaranteeing hitting spells if your opponent happens to have them in hand. I really like the way that this card works too, because there's a lot of very high power creatures and death-touching creatures that happen to be in black and red. Solitary Defiance is a 3-mana blue enchantment that rewards you for only attacking in with 1 creature and only having 1 creature. As long as you only have 1 on the battlefield, it gets Vigilance and Ward too, and whenever a creature you control attacks alone, you seek 2 non-land cards and then discard a card. I like Solitary Defiance with something like Malcolm as a commander in Brawl. I think that it helps protect your commander and gets you additional card advantage so you can cast better spells for free when you get to that 4th chorus counter. Moving on to Cathartic Operation, this is a 5-mana instant that returns up to 2 creature spells from your graveyard to your hand and then seeks 2 non-creature, non-land cards and puts them into hand. This is generally just good value, but I actually want to call to the art. The last 4 cards I showed actually all had Jace in various moments in the story, and this culminates in Jace and Vraska having this nice moment here. I also think that the flavor of this card involves Vraska bringing the creatures back from the graveyard and Jace seeking those 2 non-land, non-creature cards and putting them into hand. It's really nice to see them coming together, and also this is just a really cute piece of art. The Grave Expectations is the last of the Heist cards that I have to show today. This is a 1-mana, practically a cantrip card that lets you choose between heisting from your opponent's library and exiling up to 3 target cards from your opponent's graveyards. You also gain 3 life if you use that ability. This is a nice way to spot remove cards that your opponent is planning on either recasting or reanimating from the graveyard, or if they have something like a Fathomless Descent that you need to cut off, this takes permanents out of the grave, or getting card advantage. I feel like a 1-mana instant that gives you a choice between 3 cards, well, that's almost a ponder or a brainstorm right there. I think Grave Expectations is a fantastic card, and I look forward to playing it in decks that care about playing for my opponent's deck. Things like Jasper Flint, the Gaunty, or the Grenzo that I showed before all play nicely with Grave Expectations. Next, Stalwart Realm Warden. This is a 3-mana 2/2 with First Strike and Lifelink. Those are some very nice abilities, especially if you have something like Audric in play. But more importantly, when it enters the battlefield, the next non-creature spell target opponent casts will cost 2 more. This also has 2 relevant creature types of both humans and soldiers. Soldier specifically has a bunch of support right now in Alchemy. Stalwart Realm Warden is a really nice way of protecting a wide board. Now, if your opponent already has a lot of mana, something costing 2 more isn't going to make that much of a difference. But if you're playing an aggressive deck, you can play this on turn 3 or 4, and if your opponent was planning on casting a board wipe, they're going to have to wait until they have a little bit more mana to take out all of your creatures. And I feel like buying yourself a bit of time is always good when you're trying to take out your opponent with combat damage. The next card, Silent Extraction, is a 2-mana instant that is a counter spell, but it's a counter spell that will get you a creature card if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard. Similar to Quench, this is a 2-mana spell that forces your opponent to pay 2 mana to prevent the counter ability. But even if they do pay the 2, if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, Silent Extraction will get you a creature of the same mana value of the spell that you targeted. I think that this is very nice because sometimes these counter spells in the late game, they're not going to land. Your opponent has enough mana to pay the 2, but if they're casting something that costs 6 and you just want a creature that costs 6 from your deck, in very Simic behavior, Silent Extraction will do that for you. Switchgrass Grazer, that's very hard for me to say, by the way, is kind of great. This is a 4-mana mount. It's a 4/4 with haste, so already this is an aggressive creature. And whenever it attacks, no matter what, it deals 1 damage to any target. Now that could be your opponent, it could be a planeswalker they control, or it could be a creature they control. And if it's saddled, and it has a saddle of 1, and a creature was dealt damage with that on-attack ability, that creature cannot block, ever. And damage is not removed from that creature during cleanup steps. This is such a good way to get aggressive damage through. And since it only has a saddle of 1, you can take a small creature that you played early in the game, or a creature you just don't want to risk in combat, as what's riding in on this horse. I think there's also an honorary mention. This already has haste, but it would be really fun to put into a Shadowfax deck, because sometimes you just want to put more horses into your horse deck. Or if you happen to be playing Historic or Historic Brawl or Timeless, you could pair the Switchgrass Grazer with one of my favorite horses of all time. That would be the Crested Sunmare. Sorry, I had to double check my notes. I'm like, yeah, it's Crested Sunmare, right? Yeah, Crested Sunmare would make this indestructible. Shout out to the horses of Amonkhet. Blooming Cactus Folk is a big green creature that makes it so your other spells will be cheaper in the future. This is a 5-mana 5/5 plant druid with trample, and as long as it survives to your end step, it's going to make all of your non-lands in your hand perpetually cost 1 generic mana less. And it doesn't even need to be creatures in your hand. This could be any kind of spell. So the bigger spells you have in your hand and the longer you can keep these Cactus Folk alive, the cheaper they'll be. I think that this would be good in any ramping deck that's looking to cast a large expensive spell, as long as it has generic color pips in its cost to reduce with the Blooming Cactus Folk. I especially would like to see this in a Goreclaw Brawl deck, because she would already be reducing the Cactus Folk's cost to 3. Just extra added bonus of cost reduction there. You reduce the cost to reduce more costs. And Nashi, Illusion Gadgeteer. Yes, Nashi showed up in the story, and he gets to have a card. This is everybody's favorite rat boy, and he's in Sultai colors again. Nashi Illusion Gadgeteer is a 4-mana 4/4 with Menace and Ward 2. When he enters the battlefield, you choose a card in your graveyard, and then make a duplicate of it and put it into your hand. Notably, you do not target a card in your graveyard, and this card that you've chosen remains secret. Also, as an added benefit, with a card that you happen to put back in your hand, or I should say, make a copy of in your hand, gets flash. So if you want to do something extra sneaky, you can do it at instant speed. The next 5 cards are part of a cycle of creatures that create Moxen. These are the Collectors, starting with the Ruby Collector. This is a 1-mana 1/1 human detective, which creates a Mox Ruby the first time that you attack with 3 or more creatures. It also has an ability in red, which, notably, Mox Ruby generates red mana, that can give all of your creatures additional power. To me, this seems incredibly strong, and I could see it having a home in a Boros Convoke deck in Historic or Alchemy. Next is the Emerald Collector. This is a blue creature for 2 mana that makes you a Mox Emerald, which is the green Moxen. This is a 2-mana 1/2 human pirate, notably an outlaw, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. This is a pretty nice ability, which also pairs well with the fact that you need to draw 3 cards within 1 turn to create a Mox Emerald. You can also change its power and toughness to 4/4 for just 3 mana. Next is the Pearl Collector. The Pearl Collector is a 3-mana 3/3 human warlock, an outlaw, with Death Touch and Lifelink. It has the ability to give other creatures lifelink perpetually, and at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, if you gained 4 or more life in the turn, you create a Mox Pearl, which is the white Mox. I think that Pearl Collector is very good, and because it's able to almost trigger its own ability on its own, it in fact could trigger its ability on its own if you increase its power by 1. This seems like a really easy way to get that Moxen, or just enable a life gain deck. I could see putting this into a deck with Amalia, who cares about life gain triggers, or putting it with other life gain carrying cards like the other Pride Mates, Ajani's Pride Mate being the generic name I use for creatures that get counters when you're gaining life. Because the Pearl Collector has Death Touch, people don't want to block it, and even if they do, maybe used its other ability to give another creature lifelink forever. Sapphire Collector is a red creature, a mercenary, still an outlaw, a 3-mana 3/3 with prowess, meaning that it will temporarily gain power and toughness when you cast a non-creature spell. And if you cast 2 non-creature spells in 1 turn, you conjure a Mox Sapphire, that's the blue Mox, into your hand. Now, the real crazy part about this card, the amazing part about this card, is that for 3 mana, target instant or sorcery in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn. Its flashback cost is equal to its mana cost. There is no timing restriction on this. There is no limit to the number of times that you can activate this ability. Sapphire Collector is like if you took a dozen different Snapcaster mages and you just shoved them together into one giant prowessing creature. I think Sapphire Collector is a legitimately great card. Now, admittedly, you do have to pay 3 mana and then the cost of the card that you're flashing back, but to me, that is still a worthwhile cost if you're trying to recur lots of cards from your graveyard. And of course, you could always reduce the cost of that ability with Training Grounds, which is legal in Alchemy and almost every other format. In fact, it is legal in every single other format that Sapphire Collector is available in. Jet Collector, the last in this cycle, is the green creature, and just like the last one, it deals with graveyards. It's a 2-mana 2/2 Merfolk Scout, and at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, if you have 4 or more cards in your graveyard, you conjure a Mox Jet into your hand. Okay, that doesn't seem too hard to do. Lots of self-mill and self-mill payoff, especially with the Descend cards, and cards like Myco Tyrant. But, X black. Put target creature with mana value X from your graveyard into the battlefield with a finality counter. Activate this only as a sorcery, but activate it as many times as you would like. Jet Collector seems great. Those finality counters only make it so you can animate those things 1 time from the graveyard, but you are already being rewarded for putting things in your graveyard, and having a repeatable way to reanimate creatures is always good. The Collector cycle of cards is great. The last cards I'll be showing off in this video from Alchemy Thunder Junction aren't from the plane of Thunder Junction at all. In fact, they're all legendary creatures from the last planes that we visited, starting with Ravnica and Teysa Karlov. Teysa of the Ghost Council is the ghost of Teysa Karlov, who was murdered in Murders at Karlov Manor. She is a spirit now, and her card is extremely reminiscent of Obzedat Ghost Council, which is fitting because she's Teysa of the Ghost Council. This is a 4-mana, 0/5 Spirit Advisor that has an intensity count. Intensity is a counter that follows this between zones and continuously goes up. I shouldn't really say it's a counter because it can't be proliferated. It is a feature of the card that increases as it enters the battlefield, and it has a way to repeatably enter the battlefield. Whenever Teysa enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 white and black creature. This is a spirit token. It has flying, and her intensity goes up by 1. Spirits you control get +X/+0, where X is Teysa's intensity. In the beginning of your end step, you can choose to exile her. If you do, she returns during your next upkeep under her owner's control, and it gains haste, which means that you again will get a spirit token, and her intensity will go up. This is very fun if you have her as your commander, because it means that even if she dies and you choose to put her back into the command zone, you can cast her again in Brawl, and she will keep her intensity. She'll also enter the battlefield again, and her intensity will go up. It's very cool that we now have this new Blink or Spirits commander, and I also think that this pairs really well with King of the Oathbreakers. The next creature is Alberix, Goose Tyrant. Not entirely sure on how to say the name, but I know a Canada Goose when I see it, and I know to fear the goose. This is a 3-mana 3/3 with Flying, Trample, and Ward 1. It also has an instant speed adventure, Wild Goose Chase. For Simic mana, 1 blue and 1 green, you can draw 2 cards and then discard 2 cards and create a food token. When you cast that adventure, this creature goes into exile. And whenever you sacrifice a token, this creature perpetually gets +1/+1. This includes when it is in exile. This being a 3-mana 3/3 Flying, Trample, Ward 1 also means that you might just want to cast this immediately, because that is a powerful flying creature, just like the Goose Mother, and it pairs very well with anything that's going to be making lots of tokens and sacrificing lots of tokens. I feel like this would be a strong creature to include in many just Alchemy decks, but also I'll be putting this into my Lonus Brawl deck, because I make a lot of clue tokens and sacrifice a lot of clue tokens, and having an ever-growing goose seems like a good way to take my opponent out. Emperor Apatsek Intley IV is the Emperor of the Sun Empire, also a Naya creature, a human noble, and a 3/4. This creature rewards you for having high power, high toughness, or high mana values of creatures that you cast. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it has a power of 4 or greater, it perpetually gets haste. If it has a toughness of 4 or greater, you gain 4 life, and if its mana value is 4 or greater, you seek another creature card, allowing you to do it again. I really like the way that this ability is split up into the 3 colors. You have red for haste and power, you have green for casting high-cost creatures and getting more creature cards, and white for high toughness and life gain. Emperor Apatsek Intley IV is doing a lot for any Naya creatures deck, and especially dinosaurs, because they happen to be very high power, very high toughness, and they want to go fast. I think that this is a very fun legendary creature, and I'm looking forward to seeing it in, well, Brawl, and probably Alchemy as well. I imagine that this card is just enough value to see play across formats. Rankle, Pitiless Trickster. Oh, Rankle's back, and he's making us sacrifice and discard once again. Rankle is a fairy rogue, a 1/3 for 3 mana with flying. He also gets lifelink and haste if your opponent controls no creatures, and you can make it so your opponent has fewer creatures, because when he enters the battlefield you can pay 1 life, and then each player has to discard a card and sacrifice a creature. And each time your opponent discards a card with Rankle in play, he perpetually gets +1/+0, swinging in and dealing more damage, and rewarding you for making your opponent discard cards, which is always nice. I'm a big Tiny Bones player, so I'm a fan of the Rankle getting bigger as your opponent continues to discard. Going right back to Ixalan, we have Saint Elenda. She is a 7-mana vampire cleric, a 4/7 with lifelink, and when she enters the battlefield, you get to choose between the cards on her spellbook and put 1 into your hand. You can then cast that spell for free until end of turn. The first one is Faith's Fetters. This is an aura, and you enchant a permanent. That permanent cannot attack or block, and its activated abilities cannot be activated unless they're mana abilities. You also gain 4 life. The second spell is Ritual of Rejuvenation, an instant that gains you 4 life and draws you a card. You can also choose Invoke the Divine. This is an instant that destroys target artifact or enchantment and gains you 4 life. And finally, Inspiring Cleric, which enters the battlefield and gains you 4 life. It is a 3/2 Vampire Cleric. I'm pretty sure you all figured out that they all gain 4 life, which means that Alenda's other ability is triggered. At the beginning of your end step, if you gained life this turn, you create an XX white avatar creature token, where X is the amount of life you gained this turn. I think that Saint Alenda will always be useful since it gives you 2 different types of removal, or just a creature, and then gives you another creature in the form of that avatar as long as she survives until end step. I think Saint Alenda is an interesting life gain commander and could pair nicely with something like Heliod. And finally, we have Vona de Hierro the Antifex, a 5 mana 4/2 with Menace, a Vampire Cleric Knight, and she has an incredibly powerful Enter the Battlefield ability. When Vona de Hierro enters the battlefield, destroy target non-land, non-token permanent an opponent controls. You can then choose to discard a card to make a copy of that destroyed permanent into your hand, which you can then cast for mana of any color. This is so great. It destroys your opponent's threat and gives you a copy of it. Also, because Vona is a vampire, you can do some things like cheat it into play using the 3 mana Sorin. I do really like this card as an inclusive piece in either vampires and historic, or as a brawl card, either as just good removal in Orzhov colors, or as a commander herself. I think that Enter the Battlefield removal tends to be a very strong thing to have. And that is all 30 of the cards in Alchemy Thunder Junction. Thank you so much for watching this video, and thank you Wizards of the Coast for asking me to make this video. I loved getting to see these cards because they started giving me so many good ideas for decks that I wanted to brew. If you'd like to see more of my content, twitch.tv/Amazonian or youtube.com/Amazonian is where I make lots of brawl content. So if you want to see me use some of these legendaries to brew some decks, go check out my other channels. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching this video, and enjoy the new set.